in, and for a really good reason. It has a lot of power in your writing. It's a fun thing to work with, and I really love the humanity and kind of diversity that dialogue brings to anything you're writing, whether it's an article for a nonfiction piece, whether it's something more autobiographical, or if it's fiction. Dialogue is just great. So we're going to spend a little time on that today. Again, these are all subjects that you could spend forever on. So I'm just going to do some highlights and some exercises. For those exercises, please have a pen and paper if that's what you prefer to work with, or a Word document is also totally fine. So with that, let's just dive in here. So we're going to start with what is dialogue, because dialogue is not just talking. It's not a conversation. Dialogue is a distilled moment or string of moments that we're capturing and expressing through verbal language in a written form. And it has to have a purpose. So unlike our conversations, which kind of meander everywhere and go somewhere, and they're fun, they're in the moment, they have a purpose for us psychologically. That's not what we're doing with dialogue in a script, in a book, in a short piece, whatever it is, because no one would pay attention. So a few things about dialogue that I've distilled, which is by its nature in coming from a real or imagined human in this kind of spoken way that humans have a very specific technology, language. It's a few things. First of all, it's emotional. Or subjective, right? It's always should be essential and reflective of the speaker that's giving that speech. And it's embodied. So unlike things that we write down where our thoughts really influence what they do, we tend to experience language in our ears, in our mouths, and honestly in our whole body. So the reader better understands more when you can see and feel the character. So when you're writing dialogue, you want to think about the posture, gestures, expressions, tone, and even the setting, how these things reflect on the character and affect the character's state of mind. So really, dialogue is reactionary. It's very in the moment. And when you're writing, that's why it's like you almost want to write it all out and then cut it back and really think about it, because it is this back and forth moment. Even if it's a monologue, it's a moment within that context that's happening right now. So that brings us to the last point of what makes dialogue, and really it's that it's contextual. There's almost it's subtextual. There's psychologically and in its timeline and environment and its world, it's nuanced, it has personal culture, and it really, each character should have a little different voice or way of speaking. And that's why you see these moments in film, especially we see it because that's just the medium we have, where it's kind of weird. You're like, that person wouldn't say that. That doesn't feel natural. And immediately it breaks your faith in what you're watching. We don't want to do that. We want people to really get caught up, right? So in writing your dialogue, it should always further those overall themes, stories, ideas, and especially the character development. You want to make sure that that dialogue isn't just there because you want it there, or you feel it's witty, or you saw a great Tarantino film. You want to be careful with boring, canned, random, or really unnatural dialogue. I see this most, and I love picking it up anytime you're in a grocery store and you see those, or an airport, and you see those novels that are like, my sister loves them, the like bra busting romances. If you look at the dialogue in there, it is just the worst. No one talks like that. No one feels like that. And it really is just a great way of looking at what not to do. So we're going to jump right into our first exercise today, because I think it's going to set the stage. So for exercise 1 on dialogue, I know I usually like go off a little bit first, but I want you to think back to your oldest memory. And it's probably a bit of a pastiche of senses and years of story that you've put onto it, an image. It might be a smell. It's anything that you remember, like what's that first memory you have? And I want you to write either a monologue or a dialogue telling someone about this memory. And you can write it from any age or time you like, present, past, or future. Your future self telling your child, your past self telling your present self, however you want to do it, as long as it's in first person. So we're going to spend 3 minutes with you just, not thinking about anything but how you would tell your story of your first memory. So is everyone ready for this? Are there any questions before I start?
Just wanted to shout out the use of pastiche, amazing word.
I like it because it sounds like pistachios. So I really like pistachios. But it's also just a beautiful word. I am a lover of words. So with that, then I'm going to just start. Ready and go. 5 seconds, wrap it up. And stop. All right. Is that hard? Was that okay? Did we feel a little awkward in it? Because I always do. Anybody have comments? I'm watching the comments this time. We did a tech check. It's wonderful. Okay. So if no comments, just hold on to that. We're going to go forward. So I want to dive into here what dialogue is not. And what it's not is really real. So, but neither is our memory. And that's kind of why I like that exercise. You realize how hard it is to actually talk about what that is, what that happened, even though it's so visceral. So you think of dialogue as a way you rethink or reimagine an important conversation or an important moment without all the ums and ahs and hesitation and moments that we have in real life. So when we're doing dialogue, it's almost like that moment after you leave a fight or a romantic moment or that moment you wanted to tell your boss everything. You were like, oh, I missed it. I really wish I had said X, right? That beautiful moment that we see in films where you're like, how do they speak so naturally and cleverly and real? But it's not really real. It's never even really objective, even if it's true. It's being pointed out for a specific reason, and it has to kind of work to create. Now, it can be the root of a story, but it's still part of an overall story or message. And the audience is always both the intended character or context. So two people talking to be that other person, but it's also the reader or listener. So in real life, that person listening, they're okay with the tangents, the things that kind of root us in the moment. But the reader will get lost. So we generally tend to write these things and then carve them down. We think about why it's there. So writing a dialogue, I think of as kind of like panning for gold. We're literally sifting up all the stuff that's really there, and we're shaking it out, looking for what really is the most valuable moment inside that dialogue. We're asking ourselves why. So it's a lot of the time it's in what you don't say. So I wrote this little bit of dialogue to kind of express how it is we can do it in this dialogue. Can you pass the orange juice? She asks from the opposite end of the table without looking up. Good morning. My toast is cold and there's a small half moon out of it that I'm picking with my only unbitten nail. Can you pass the juice? Her voice feels coiled and cold. My fingers stop. Why? I look up and notice the pale band on her finger where the skin is shining. Because I asked you to? You don't like juice. Maybe I just don't normally have it, Frank. What's that supposed to mean? I say, rubbing my neck. Maybe I don't like making the bed, but I do it. Maybe there are things we both like and don't do, or some do without the other knowing. A habit's still a habit after 6 years. Maybe it's a habit after the first time. Maybe I'm starting new habits, Frank. Maybe you already have. And the point of that little bit of dialogue, you can read it if you want, is just that when we talk or when we see dialogue, we want to feel it. We don't want to say, she said angrily, he said, she said, under everything. And we're taught that we should always do that. But really, once you've introduced and set a context, once there's something that we don't know, we really move with the dialogue. And that's where dialogue gets effective, is that it's often in ordinary moments, but they're captured in a way to create something that's pulling us into the story and something that's a little real. So again, you don't want to spell it all out, I guess is what I'm really saying. So we're going to jump into exercise too, because I decided we're going to do lots of exercises here. And this is what I'm calling Give It Up for Diapers and New Feels. So in 3 minutes, I want you to go into someone else's perspective. We just went over that dialogue is really embodied. And the dialogue is often not about just what we say, but the feels and the things that go there. So babies can't talk for themselves. We're going to do a 3-minute exercise where we're going to write a dialogue for the baby. I don't care if it's a monologue, if they're just talking out loud to themselves, if they're talking to their mom or dad or you or an audience. Make up whatever you want. But this baby with this rather odd expression, and if you don't like this baby, make up a baby in your head, but just get in a moment of that dialogue, and spend 3 minutes just writing whatever dialogue you want. Ready and go. Okay, 30 seconds. All right, and stop. Okay, I find that one kind of hard. I'm working along with you today, and it's hard to try and think and feel like a baby would think and feel and put context to it. I don't know. Did anyone have a easy or hard time with this?
Yeah, I found it tricky. I kind of assumed the baby was not happy. I'd be interested, did everybody else kind of go down that path with their dialogue?
Yeah,
Very unhappy.
I assume the baby wanted to be in the at the park in a real swing, not in this crappy plastic
Right.
yellow swing that doesn't hardly move. So
Nice cat. I went with, sorry, go Lynette.
Okay, so I also thought the baby didn't like the swing. I think it's pretty obvious. So those are just kind of some warm-up exercises I wanted to do. Now, staying in the ring, it's a few rules to give your dialogue purpose, impact, and intrigue. And purpose is, I think, the most important thing in dialogue. And if there is no purpose, there's no point. And dialogue can do so much, right? So it's exposition or big reveals, it's establishing and showcasing characters, setting up conflict or tension, anchoring or highlighting story development. It can really emote. It can give you humor, love, and anger and things that otherwise kind of fall flat. And it can narrate plot points and break fourth walls if you wanted to. So what I love most, though, is this whole breaking the monotony stylistically. You have a whole lot of, especially when you're doing longer pieces, it can get really difficult to feel like, okay, well, you're just talking at me. I'm just reading, and he said, she said, plot point, plot point. Dialogue is great, but it also has to be a team player. It needs to connect those plays and build interest. So when you're thinking about where to put dialogue in, you want to think of like one or the other. Don't do both. I see people do that, right? They're like, I'm going to write all this down and then I'm going to write the dialogue to support it. What you want to do is replace some of those moments with dialogue so that it kind of happens. And it needs to be better than real. So dialogue really helps us with this suspension of disbelief, and that occurs when the best of what we're relating to is distilled down into something pithy and meaningful, which is that panning for gold idea. It's immersive. So arguably, all of writing is supposed to be immersive, fiction or nonfiction. Dialogue is 1000% must sound real to the audience and truly reflect the character. And what's funny about that is the way we write, of course, excludes a lot of the stuff that we naturally do, the kind of bad language, the clumsy language. It's our idealized self, but it still needs to sound like something your idealized self would say. So it needs to be authentic. It has to be nuanced. Like, all people don't sound alike. It's why we can recognize the way our parents speak. It needs to be tight and clean dialogue. You want to cut out a lot. I frequently overwrite, so I'm really big on editing. So to distill the real into the real that we want, again, it's that moment of when we've missed that opportunity to say something. And while it has to sound 1000% real, in real life, we know, as I've said, conversation doesn't work that way. So we want to always edit our dialogue to do a few things. We want to cut all unnecessary lines. Those extra he said, she said, they said, we said, like it gets redundant. And when things rhyme, we stop hearing the meaning. You want to reduce dead or redundant language. I just said like that whole he said thing, but also dead language. That refrain that's like laughed gleefully. Well, I would hope it's a gleeful laughter. Unless it's a maniacal laughter, then put it there because that maniacalness is interesting, right? So we're looking at contrast there. The way we can do it instead is about why that line is important. So anything that comes after that line or before it should be framing that line. It gives us a view into the character. And we want to ask if all parts are really truly serving a purpose and what that purpose is. I wrote a novel years ago, for example, and it it was very 20 something of me in certain parts that I later cut out because I went through and it was all this exposition, all these statements and ideas I had, but I was really being pedantic about what the audience could understand and not letting them do the work. And it made it kind of long-winded. I've had a friend who was like, well, it's very Joycean. And I was like, oh, that's inaccessible and long-winded. That's great. And I did about 4 different revisions of this very long piece of work that took me about 10 years to do. But again, you want to go through all those parts and really carve it out. That's easier when you're doing dialogue exercises like this. So you can write it all out, everything you do today, think about how to play with it later, how to cut it down and put it back together. And the pro tip, the kind of way I check this is if you remove all the language outside those quotation marks, would it make sense? Redo the language outside the quotation marks to add tone, to add to that bit of dialogue instead of, well, he just said it, so we knew he said it. So what does he said do there? I can cut that, right? As long as there's not so much back and forth that I need to know who's speaking. So it's a little bit of trust in the audience here, in the reader and who you're speaking to, as well as knowing that the more nuance you have with your characters, the more when they say something, especially as you get into a piece, people are going to recognize them. Just like we all do. I always say bye before I leave the phone. My dad pointed that out to me. And I know that when people talk to me, that I'm the person that says bye at the end of a happy phone call. So your characters probably have things like that too, and you can steal it from people you know. So this next one, authenticity. I like to basically call yourself on your own bull from the start, right? Before you even start creating characters or starting off that dialogue, why are you writing that character? How do you know them? And if someone asked you about them, would you be able to? We've done work in this workshop series on character, and that's why it's so important, because once you know the character, you can find their voice, you can work on it, and you can kind of call yourself and like, does that really sound like them? One thing I want to note here, though, never make assumptions about other people, especially around identity, socioeconomics, culture, ethnicity, religion. People love to do that because they want to get their point out. And honestly, it just sounds insensitive and unrealistic. It becomes a caricature. You can end up sounding very tone deaf to people and things around you. And honestly, you're just going to write better writing from what you know. So consider when you're establishing those voices before you write your dialogue to use your lived experience and apply it to that character or the characters that you're creating. So much so that you want to like your villains. Like if you're writing something that has a real villain, you want to understand their motivations. And it'll make your audience understand their motivations. There's a reason why, whether you like it or not, Christian Grey has this whole backstory in Shades of Grey about being, from an dysfunctional family and why this big fantasy can exist. You want to use memories and people around you for this source material. Observations. I love eavesdropping in bars and restaurants and parks to what people are saying, how they really talk to each other. The cultural context for people. What does it mean to them? Why do they say the things they do, and how do they say it? You don't want to make up Southern dialogue, but if you're Southern, you want to use it. Because there's, first of all, lots of cool turns of phrase. Interviews with real people for your characters that aren't you or based on you. Research alone is not understanding. So those interviews are super important. Talk to people and have them check it. Like if you're writing something from an older person's perspective, use an older person to say, is this something you really think about? Is this something you feel? Does this resonate with you? And, make sure that if you're writing ahistorically or in a different timeline, even if it's a future timeline, that you're checking that historical context. Does it make sense? Or is it something that you're writing from your perspective and applying backwards? It's always bothered me, like those knights in shining armor romances. I'm like, ooh, knights smelled horrible. I don't know if that's a good idea hygienically. So again, checking from inside someone's shoes is super important. And these things will just kind of help you along. So keeping that in mind, this purpose, this identity in our characters, we're going to go through exercise 3. It's 5 minutes. We're going a little longer because I think we've had a little warm up. We're going to be using mostly monologue or dialogue, but this time we're going to tell a story or have a context where we tell a story about our real life that's not all that great. Instead of our best memory, pick something that's a little embarrassing or something like a bad date or rejection or an interview you flopped, something you really wanted but it didn't come through, or something disappointing, heartbreaking, or awkward. This is an autobiographical exercise and you don't have to share it, but I think we have a lot of emotion that attaches to these moments and we have really visceral memories on them. So this is a great way of looking at what dialogue really feels like, and that struggle that's in dialogue can be very real for you as you try and tell these stories. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start. 5 minutes. Okay, 30 seconds. And stop. Okay. Told you, I'm working along with you this time. Dialogue is really hard, and I'm guessing a few of you are feeling that at the moment. It's not as fun as people like to think, because it's difficult to kind of remember a memory, a real moment, and think of what was said or how we would say it to someone else. And I think there's a lot of emotion that goes into writing dialogue. Did anyone else experience that? We're all pretty quiet, but it would be really common to experience this kind of struggle with how things were said. And you start realizing why dialogue is so powerful, because how things were said, when they were said, why, and how we felt as a response to it is really emotional. So getting to it works. Now, there's a fallacy of nonfiction. I started you off on something kind of hard. Nonfiction is often full of lies we tell ourselves. And when you look at autobiographies, you often see that they're very fanciful, they're very positive, they're very, overcoming stories with a real gloss over the depth, and no one ever fails. No one who fails writes a autobiography about failure. And so we kind of lose something in a lot of our nonfiction writing. And I say this because I think it's actually really powerful to use nonfiction writing as a source, kind of the way actors method act, right? So nonfiction is really a powerful way to gain authenticity and to persuade an audience, because it is so real, it's so visceral. But it's hard to do because of how vulnerable we feel, and that stops us from being able to write really everything or even know how to say it. So that naked moment, being that naked, most people put on a kind of figurative towel in the form of glossing over details, omitting uncomfortable or counter arguments, making the argument instead of making the story. You're trying to justify what happened or your perspective, and not letting the audience make up their own mind. It's literally easier to tell the truth when we have a pseudonym or a fictional context. And when we use what we know to, we want to use what we know to get to that truth, that emotional truth we kind of feel when we're trying to struggle through this dialogue exercise. But we want to wrap it in a safe writing context, because the best stories always draw from a truth of some kind, an emotional truth, a thematic truth, a social truth, a psychological truth, something so real that someone relates to it, but that we're actually free to write about in an authentic way. So to do that, what we want to do is we want to show and not tell. And audiences want to feel and not be told what to feel. So that thing when we're trying to write what we feel like it should be, what we want the outcome to be, we're often entreating the audience too hard to feel what we feel, instead of trusting what we're writing to be convincing. So that's the problem with exposition, or the blank, like kind of telling of things, is it can be a powerful tool, but it's often a shortcut we've adopted in our own lives to understand kind of what's said. So we say he was angry. Well, that's actually a conclusion we experienced at the end of someone coming in very upset, and us having a moment. Well, they were pissed off at me. Well, they probably were, but it took an experience to get there, and we want to make people experience that with us. So it's not enough to say, my dad was angry at the way the inheritance got divided. We lost the house. It was the first time I saw my dad cry. I mean, that's okay. It's the start of a conversation in real life. And we can flesh that out. So for that example, instead of saying my dad was angry, you can say he seemed bigger when angry. My dad didn't say anything. He poured a glass of water and sat at the table. The vein that ran from his eyelid to the center of his brow looked like a fault about to burst. His fist was clenched. I guess we let bygones be, he finally said. The engine of my uncle's car was already a mosquito humming in the distance. It looks like you'll have to change schools. I'm sorry, son. I thought I heard him choke. A small droplet fell from his face to the table. Damn hot these days, he said, pulling the kerchief out of his pocket. It's a much more powerful way to explain a moment using dialogue. And it requires, again, that framing, right? That, we feel it. We understand what it's like to be the child watching that, to be the father embarrassed and angry at what's going on. And we get a story built into the dialogue. And what we're doing with that is we're backing up the themes and ideas and the things we want to say with an emotional proof, with something someone can feel and hook onto, that you can say, she was, she was a loving girl. But if you just say that, what does it mean? If you say she was a loving girl, she tried to do her best by everyone. She once baked a cake for an aunt she had never met simply because she found out her aunt was sick. Her aunt died the next week, and she did another cake the next week after that for her family. Something like that, that shows what we're doing, why it matters. And so dialogue isn't just dialogue, right? It's story. Taking that in mind, I want to do another exercise here. We're doing lots of exercises today. It wasn't me. And that thing that you just wrote, did you say it happened to you? Based on these real life stories, this experience you had that was awkward or uncomfortable in some way, I want you to create a fictional dialogue where there's at least two people. It's written in third person. If you want to write it in first person, you can. It's just easier for people, I think, to distance themselves in third person. So this is a character. And so this new character, which is inspired by your own experience, should be reflected in the changes in the dialogue. Be sure to show, not tell with this context as much as possible. And you can totally embellish on this as much as you want. So we're going to take 5 minutes. Was 5 minutes too long last time? I think these are hard, so I've given a little more time. Is everyone okay with 5 minutes?
Yeah, I thought it worked well.
Okay, cool. If it's too short, tell me there too. But I think that it gives time to start things and think through it without it being too awkward. And if you hate it, you can go to the bathroom or something. All right. I'm going to start now. 30 seconds. And stop.
Oh, you're on mute, Christine.
Sorry, I remuted. Okay, so hopefully that was a little easier than our previous tasks. I think it's, once you have that source material, I know for me anyways, as I'm kind of going along with you on this, it was much easier for me to write it from a third person perspective. I could take this moment and kind of make my position in it, I don't know if anyone else did this, kind of a more heroic position than the fumbling person I was in real life, and make the other character a little more distilled into where that tension is and why it was such a disappointing and awkward experience. It's a little easier. Anyone else have any feedback on this? I know with these intense things, it can be hard to share. So
Yeah, the third person made it feel not as raw, I guess. So you could kind of still capture it a little bit, but it just didn't feel quite as brutal, I guess.
exactly. But we have the feeling, we know why it's important, why it's brutal, but that third person really helps. That's why I think it's a little more honest very often when we tell a story where we're a little safer. And I think sometimes moving, if you want to do nonfiction, writing it like it's fiction first and then reframing can be a great trick.
Yeah. Kat, sorry, did I cut you off, Kat? I apologize if I did.
Kat?
No, I actually found this one easier than writing the initial dialogue, primarily because there were 3 people involved in my story, and I was able to make one of them a character asking questions about what happened. So it worked much better than I thought it would.
Nice.
That's awesome. Anyone else? Yeah, we kind of went from the emotional part into the story part, and I think that really helps connect them together. You're still rooting on something real, right? But it's so much easier to get that flow when you can kind of alter the characters and the dialogue a little bit. And I think you'll find it's a really great tool of applying your experience to something that is important and has a real world application. So part of that exercise and that discomfort that's important is the tension is really tempting to an audience, right? One of the most important story elements, and dialogue just has to have story in it, is that tension. You can almost get rid of all other things that are storied in, like plot points, all of the constructs, the setting, and just use tension and really explain the journey that we're doing from a dialogue perspective. So that question is like, why are we saying anything at all? And we say things not because we're stating the obvious. I think boring writing does that a lot. Like, we didn't know, we couldn't cut to the chase. Every speech act is really a proposition that's aiming to do something to the listener, right? In our normal lives, we do that. It can be performative, right? Like, it can be something really binding. I say I do in a wedding and suddenly I'm married. I don't say it and we've got a whole different story. It can be a declaration or reveal when someone says something like, I tried to imagine life before you and I couldn't anymore. I realized that it was the future that was permanently changed by that. It can be an attempt to make something more real because the character is insecure, which we all are. I think insecurity is a great thing to acknowledge. Like saying, just stay a little longer instead of saying, please don't go. We often make those choices in our own lives because we're struggling. And that struggle, that tension is part of what really pulls people in. Tension naturally wants resolution and invests the reader in that uncertainty. That's why it's such a great thing to have in dialogue. That's why it's part of story, right? It is making something that wants to be resolved. And so what happens after, any of those statements that I said a moment ago, if someone says a declaration like, I can't imagine my world without you, and now I know the future is going to be changed forever. We want to know what truth comes out of that. What does the other person say? Is it going to be a proposal? Is it going to be a runaway? What's happening there? And if nothing comes of it, that's okay, because then it's a tragedy. That's one example. Simply because what we've done is, with dialogue, we've created an expectation for those words to change someone or something for our reader and for the characters involved. Speech is such a powerful way that humans try and exert influence on their world around them. It's a way of us making reality and a way of externalizing our thoughts. And it's just as clumsy and fragile and fraught as that process is. So it's a wonderful thing to be able to get to. And keeping all of that in mind, and getting towards the end of our session, I want to take another moment to do a couple of just finishing exercises. Dialogue is really hard, and I think exercises are really important for it. So this one is called Between Us, and it's a 5-minute dialogue between people. So this doesn't have to be about you, and I just want you to try and tell a story. Using mostly dialogue, and if you notice, like in my examples, I root my dialogue a lot in the context of what they're saying. So try and tell a story through that. You can use the people to the right or anyone in your head, and consider drawing from people you know. And I'm going to just start. I think for the sake of time, I'm actually going to do it as a 3-minute exercise. So you can start now. Thirty seconds. And stop. Hopefully it's a little easier kind of getting through this. Feedback for a second. All right, so we're going to jump into the last exercise just to close. I want to make the most of our time together here. And I'm going to call this one more thing. We've been kind of on the fly jumping one thing to another. For this one, I want you to write a dialogue using one of the objects. If you want to build on the dialogue that you're using, you can also use that as an option. Pick one or more of the objects to the right in this image. So there's a cup of chamomile tea, an old 400 TX, roll of film, a dial phone, for those of you who don't know what those are, and a dinosaur. You can pretend it's real if you want. Anyway, so those are the things. And if you need people or context, we can also pick from any of these people I've thrown together here. Sorry, I clearly messed up on the pagination. And yes, cat, it is last century. I have one in my house just for kicks and giggles. But pick from these people and these things. And we're going to do a final 4-minute exercise. It'll go 1 minute over. If you want, you can stop at the hour. And we're starting now. 15 seconds. Okay, and stop. All right, I know it has been an hour. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. I really appreciate all of you who stuck in. I understand if you had to leave. Any questions, comments, or thoughts before we say goodbye today? I know these are intense, so a lot of people don't necessarily feel like talking too much.
Just to say, this has been awesome. Thanks, Christina.
No problem.
This has been an intense one today, but it's really been good.
You know, you guys requested dialogue, and I have to say, I was like, wow, dialogue's super hard.
It's great.
But it's a really powerful tool if you can get to it. I often recommend like reading Steinbeck or Hemingway and those kinds of authors if you really want to get used to what dialogue can do for writing. It really goes well with simplified writing as well. If you have ideas about what you want to do next time, please let me or Peter know, and I'm happy to consider. I can tailor these to whatever people want. If you want more or less of something, or if you'd like to change something, that feedback really helps us out. But thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Christina. Have a good day, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Have a great weekend.